Is there any effort to restore the Culp area to the way it looked during the battle? It's really
overgrown.
I think what makes
a couple years ago, actually, they got rid of a lot of the brush. They did a full rehabilitation of Culp just in the early 2020s, and it's already grown back.
Yeah.
I don't know what their current plans are, or if there are any plans at the moment. How projects work here at Gettysburg is they tend to come down the pipeline. I don't know if I mentioned, I used to be an interp. My current job is park historian. So basically anytime there's a project on the battlefield, my job is to go in, dig through, look at the historical significance, make sure nothing is going to be impacted negatively, or if it is there a way to mitigate that? And those projects tend to come to me on a haphazard basis, meaning I walk into work and it's, hey Rachel, by the way, we've got this new project to work on. Let's see how it goes. Sometimes they're little projects. Recently I was working on something involving orchards and fences, which is why I knew that about the orchards. Other times it's larger scale projects like National Cemetery or Klingel, for example. Although, I will clarify, I have nothing to do with Klingel at the moment, so if you're upset about Klingel, it's not on me. Yes?
Is that cellar accessible?
I mean, technically, yeah, it has a lock that can be opened up there, but I have never been in it, and I've never actually opened it. So my guess is that, yes, you can go down there theoretically, but I don't know for sure. I will, however, at the end of the stop, once we get started, I will see about bringing out my key so we can go into the main house. Yeah, that's right. Perks of coming on a battle walk. Sometimes you get to go inside of structures. All right, and on that note, 10 o'clock on the dot. So let's get started with the main tour for the day. If I haven't said so, and I believe I haven't, welcome everyone. My name is Rachael Nicholas, former interp ranger, current park historian. I'm going to be leading today's battle walk titled, We Were There When It Begun, Free and Enslaved People Here at the Battle of Gettysburg. We are standing here outside of one of the more well-known structures associated with African American history here at Gettysburg, that of the Abraham Bryan House. But even though we're starting here, the narrative is going to go back a little further to well before this house was built. 1780 is the year the Gradual Abolition Act is passed in the state of Pennsylvania. It will help free future generations, but no one who is enslaved at the time of its passage will be freed by it. In addition to that, because of Pennsylvania's proximity to Maryland and Virginia, which will continue to be states with slavery for a long period of time, combine that with the gradual abolition of slavery, and what that means is that slavery still very much has a hold and an impact on this region well and long after it's actually abolished. As a result, people will frequently be racially profiled in Gettysburg. There is a risk of being kidnapped as a fugitive slave in the antebellum, or what we know as the pre-war period. And African Americans living here in Gettysburg will learn from those experiences and will act accordingly when the actual battle begins, when the campaign starts and Confederate forces begin to invade Pennsylvania in June. Many will leave Gettysburg. Abraham Bryan will be one of them. Others will stay and will talk about their stories, how they conceal themselves, what they're feeling, what they're doing here. And we have at least one notable instance of someone actively fighting back, which we will explore more in depth. But even though there is a decent community here in size, of roughly 186 free people of color live here in 1860, by the time of the battle, because people will be leaving, the impression of African Americans arriving with the Confederate Army is that there's no one here. Spencer Glasgow Welch, who is a Confederate soldier, will talk about an enslaved camp servant who has come with him by the name of Wilson. And he says that Wilson tells to him that he does not like Pennsylvania very much, quote, because he saw no black folks. Now the reality is that they've either left for the battle or they are here and they are hiding themselves. But from the perspective of Wilson, he's not seeing anyone here. He's from South Carolina. He's used to seeing a large black population where he is, and in the Army of Northern Virginia as well. Although the idea of the black Confederate soldier is a myth, and we will explain that at length, even though that's the case, there are many African Americans who are coming up with the Confederate Army as enslaved people who are brought along performing basic functions in the Army. Cooking, for example, serving as teamsters. Others will be impressed and are not with the Army directly on the battlefield, but they're in places like Richmond, helping to build fortifications and breastworks. These are people identified by historian Kevin Levin as being enslaved camp servants. And they are also going to be on this battlefield in 1863, and we will talk about their story. Ultimately, when they leave and when those who had fled come back, or those who were hiding will reemerge, then they will come back to find that Gettysburg is a tattered, war-torn landscape. And many of them, having been traumatized very much by this campaign, the fear of potentially being kidnapped and enslaved, they want to fight back in some way. They didn't necessarily have an opportunity to fight back during the battle in 1863. Not any large examples we know of anyway. But people will take those memories of the Battle of Gettysburg and their experiences, and subsequently in 1864, many local African Americans from Gettysburg and the surrounding area of Adams County, they're going to enlist with what was known as the United States Colored Troops. And they would essentially say, we were there when the battle began, and at the time we hadn't been able to do anything. But now that we're here, we are going to fight back. We will never be caught at the beginning of a battle where we cannot fight again. So that is the story I'm going to share with you today. Those who are free and enslaved, how they react, how they experience this campaign, and ultimately what they do when the battle itself is finally over. So let us take a step back in time and just a little before the battle. I mentioned 1780, but I'll go even back a little further. 1774. Before Gettysburg itself has become a borough here in Pennsylvania, it is still an area that is very much being settled. There are people documented in this region, settlers going back to the 1740s. But in 1774, a man by the name of Alexander Dobbin is going to arrive here in Gettysburg. You might recognize his name because of the Dobbin House. Any of you been there? Yeah. Well, then you certainly recognize the house in this picture, and then just below it is an older image. Alexander Dobbin, the reverend associated with the location, comes here in 1774, purchases about 200 acres in what is known as the Marsh Creek Valley, and 2 years later he's going to come back and of course build that famous stone house which will double as a school. And two of the people he brings with him at the time, who likely help him build that property, are two enslaved individuals. So African Americans as well as white settlers had been in the Gettysburg region since well before the 19th century. There's also James Geddes, you might think about, for whom the town is named. He is going to be the one who ultimately incorporates the borough around 1800, allowing it to become the borough it is today. And he too is going to own enslaved people. And the reason that we know individuals like Alexander Dobbin and James Geddes enslaved people at the time that this borough is being established, the reason we know that is because there is a register of enslavers specifically for Adams County. And that goes back to that 1780 Gradual Abolition Act that I previously mentioned. That word is crucial. Not just abolition, but the word gradual. The point is that unlike some other states in the North, Pennsylvania is not going to sign an act that gets rid of slavery overnight. They're going to do it gradually, so those who do own enslaved people still have time to transition and to frankly profit financially off of the labor of those that they enslaved. Per the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, that meant when it was passed, anyone born after the date of its passage, March 1st, I believe, would become free upon turning 28 years of age. So they would serve in a position of indenture servitude for 28 years. Those, however, born prior to that act's passage, they would remain enslaved. So in order to distinguish those who would remain enslaved from those who would eventually be entitled to freedom, the Gradual Abolition Act is going to order, quote, that every person who is or shall be the owner of any slave or servant for life to, quote, deliver in writing to the clerk of the peace of the county the name and names of any such slave and slaves and servants for life. And I actually have a copy of that register from the early 1800s right here. This is the slave birth register of Adams County, and the first name you're actually going to see up there, or one of the first, is going to be that of Alexander Dobbin. And the names that are listed there are two of the people he registered as being born to his household as enslaved people. For example, Sal, born August 20th, 1803. Amy, January 30th, 1805. I encourage you to look through this register. This is available through Adams County Historical Society, and you can find it online.
Thank you.
The purpose of explaining the Gradual Abolition Act to you is to point out that Gettysburg, although it's in Pennsylvania, a state that we associate with free labor, especially by the time of the Civil War, during its earliest days, that's not necessarily the case. Even though by the time Gettysburg comes into existence, this Gradual Abolition Act has already been passed, there are still enslaved people living in the state of Pennsylvania, and will continue to be enslaved up through about the 1840s. So the last enslaved person to live in Pennsylvania doesn't die until rather shortly before the Civil War. And that gives you a sense about how ambiguous freedom actually here is, especially right on a border, on the Mason-Dixon line dividing Maryland from Pennsylvania, free and enslaved labor. That proximity of slavery is going to influence the lives of free people of color who live here in Gettysburg. And a good number of them will. Because although the gradual abolition of slavery is indeed gradual, it is quite slow. Over time, free communities of color are going to emerge in Pennsylvania. They're certainly the most prominent in cities. You might think of Philadelphia, for example, but they emerge in more rural locations, like the town of Gettysburg as well. In 1860, as I mentioned, there's over 150 free people of color living here in Gettysburg. Many of them are laborers, kind of doing menial work, cooks, but others will become, like Abraham Bryan, property owners. They're farmers. We have examples of blacksmiths, veterinarians living here in Gettysburg. Others are going to be living not out in the farm fields where we are at the heart of the battle, but many are going to be living in town on Washington Street, which was historically the home of many members of Gettysburg's African American community and continues to be so today. You can go and see St. Paul's AME Church located there. When the congregation is first established in the early 1800s, it's not in that building. It'll actually be located on Franklin Street, but it will later move to Washington Street. On Washington Street, you have Gettysburg notables like the janitor from Gettysburg College, Jack Hopkins, who is going to be a well-regarded member of the black community. He is going to live there, as well as many others. So what we have here, really, by 1860, although it's not a huge community, it is indeed a thriving one. It is a successful one that tries to take its success to help others. Given the location of Gettysburg, right here at the intersection of free and enslaved labor on the Mason-Dixon line, as you might guess, there are frequent refugees passing through this area. Gettysburg, South Central Pennsylvania, is very much connected to the Underground Railroad, and Gettysburg's free black community will take that risk of associating themselves with the Underground Railroad. In fact, they will establish a refugee slave society within the congregation of St. Paul's AME Church. They're going to risk their lives in their own freedom. One such individual who does this is a fellow by the name of Basil Biggs. If you know anyone here in Gettysburg's historic African black community, you've probably heard the story of Basil Biggs, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. We don't have extensive documentation regarding this information because the Underground Railroad, despite being the just system, was of course illegal in the 1850s, the 1840s. Helping enslaved people escape to freedom was illegal. So people who were participating in the Underground Railroad, they had to be quiet about it, especially if they were fellow African Americans whose own freedom would be at risk. So Basil Biggs, we only know about his association with the Underground Railroad because when he eventually passes away, it's going to be discussed in his obituary. But what he's going to do, he's going to leave Gettysburg when he's helping people on the Underground Railroad. He's going to go north towards Biglerville. He's going to where a community known as Yellow Hill is located. That's a historic African American community in Manalapan Township. And if I've said that incorrectly, Andrew, please forgive me. As you might tell, I love Gettysburg, but I didn't grow up here. But in the northern part of Adams County, Yellow Hill is located. That's a historic black community prior to the Civil War. And Basil Biggs and others are going to make their way up there, connect with other members of the Underground Railroad in order to escort people to freedom. And in some cases, they will receive help from white abolitionists. One of the more well-known stories of abolitionism in Gettysburg relates to McAllister's Mill. It's where the golf course, the mini golf course, used to be located for those of you who have been coming here or have lived here for many years. But McAllister's Mill was a well-known stop on the Underground Railroad, and McAllister's son Theodore would talk about what he saw there in the 1850s, the risks that were being taken. He would write after the war, quote, "This old mill sheltered many fugitive slaves. From 1850 to 1858 was the period in which they came the most frequently." In other words, in the years after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. He writes, "I was during this time from 8 to 16 years of age, and many of these fugitives were neither seen nor heard of by any member of our large family except myself until they were far on their way to Canada. But there were never any questions asked if quantities of rations disappeared from the cellar and pantry, and I noticed old clothing was placed very conveniently to my hand on the garret of the old home. And crouched then, under the lower level, in the cog-pit of that old mill, I listened to some horrible tales of cruelty told by those young, mostly yellow men, as they rested their weary legs and filled themselves up in preparation for another race for the bleak north." It's a powerful quote. People hiding out, provisions being slid to them just on the sly. And what always stood out to me about this account was his description of the enslaved people that were seeking freedom. He refers to them as mostly yellow men. That's not a description you would usually hear today, but in the 1850s and 1840s, when someone used that term, it was their way of designating that someone was mixed race, of black and white heritage. So for enslaved individuals, you have to consider under what circumstance is that heritage being produced. One of the individuals we will talk about later today is Katherine Payne, who is born to an enslaved mother, but also to her enslaver is the one who will ultimately father her. Hence why you get descriptions of lighter skin from people such as Theodore McAllister. They're taking great risks coming to McAllister's Mill, or going further up into northern Adams County. People are on the watch for potential enslaved people, because not everyone living in Gettysburg or in Adams County more broadly is sympathetic to the cause of enslaved people seeking freedom. There are those who are, of course, sympathetic. For example, an anti-slavery society will form actually at McAllister's Mill. They will congregate there on July 4th, 1836, nearly 200 years ago, and declare themselves committed to the proposition that all men are created equal. But the Adams County Anti-Slavery Society would receive some blowback in Gettysburg. There are people who are absolutely opposed to the existence of an anti-slavery society. And from their perspective, they were opposed to it for good reason. Because, again, of Gettysburg's proximity to Maryland, to Virginia, to Delaware. That means economically, Gettysburg and South Central Pennsylvania are strongly connected to the border south, to economies with enslaved people. And they want to maintain their strong economic relations with the South, which means they don't want to be perceived as hostile to their interests. They don't want to potentially make enemies. And that's why actually in the 1830s, when Pennsylvania writes and establishes a new state constitution, it will actually remove a provision that had previously allowed wealthy African American men to vote in the state of Pennsylvania. But that will be sacrificed on the altar of slavery in order to appease the South, especially as tensions that will culminate in the Civil War are building in that antebellum period. All of this is to say is that living in Gettysburg as a free person of color like Basil Biggs, or even like Abraham Bryan, who we'll talk about in a few moments, it's not a guaranteed freedom. It is definitely a very tenuous freedom. Because not only are there people in Gettysburg who are politically hostile to enslaved people seeking freedom, but you have wanted ads in all the Gettysburg newspapers, especially in the early 19th century. If you have an account with newspapers.com, Ancestry.com, it's not hard to go on there, type just the phrase wanted, or type the phrase fugitive, and if you look at early 19th century newspapers in Gettysburg, you will see there are ads placed there by enslavers from Maryland and Virginia asking Pennsylvanians to be complicit in returning freedom seekers to slavery. An example of one such advertisement that was posted here in Gettysburg is for a man by the name of Luke Adams from Montgomery County, Maryland. His enslavers said that, quote, Luke Adams had burnt the subscriber's new barn containing about 9,000 weight of tobacco for fear of punishment, for which there was no doubt the cause ultimately of his departure. So there are wanted ads. People can potentially be turned in at any moment. They have a target on their back. And in addition to that, free people of color have targets on their back. Because what's occurring here is what you might call an early iteration of racial profiling. Enslavers, those who are, quote, slave hunters, slave catchers coming into Gettysburg, they're looking for someone that they perceive as African American. And they're not always going to readily distinguish someone who was born into freedom from someone who had potentially just escaped into freedom. And that's going to result in free people of color in Gettysburg essentially having targets on their backs. And one very well-known example of that is connected to Abraham Bryan, the free African-American farmer who owned this house, who lived here during the Battle of Gettysburg. Before he lived in this house, he was married to a woman by the name of Katherine Payne. And Katherine Payne, we know for a fact, is born into slavery. She had been born in Rappahannock County, Virginia. As I said, born to an enslaved mother, but also born to her enslaver, a man by the name of Samuel Maddox. However, when he dies in the 1840s, Katherine Payne is not freed. She will instead be inherited by his wife, Mary Maddox. But Mary Maddox makes a crucial decision. Instead of allowing Katherine Payne to remain enslaved, she actually decides to grant freedom. She decides to manumit or emancipate Katherine Payne and her children and to bring them up to Adams County, Pennsylvania. This is done very deliberately. By the 1840s, 1850s in Virginia, there were rather strict rules. Free people of color, or rather enslaved people, could be manumitted by their enslavers. Enslavers were allowed to decide if they wanted someone to go free or not. But there was a requirement that within a year of that manumission, that they subsequently be brought further up north, taken out of the state of Virginia. Virginia does not want to encourage the growth of free communities of color because those are seen as posing a potential threat to the racial order, to the foundation on which slavery is built. They don't want enslaved people getting the idea that they can potentially live as free. So when manumissions occur in this time period, those who are freed, like Katherine Payne, are then required to leave the state. And she and her children are going to come up, not specifically to the borough of Gettysburg, but they're going to come up here to Adams County. They will live in Manalapan Township, further north of here. They're going to set up shop. In fact, it's said that Mary Maddox will sign an additional set of manumission papers, will eventually leave, and Katherine Payne and her children are going to live in relative peace here in Adams County until about 1845. Because Mary Maddox, the woman who decided she'd manumit Katherine Payne, she ultimately decides that she's going to sell her farm in Rappahannock County, Virginia, to her nephew, inconveniently also named Samuel Maddox, so that makes the historic record a bit blurry. But Samuel Maddox Jr. is going to inherit the farm that had belonged to his uncle. But he is not content with that. Because theoretically, if Mary Maddox had not freed Katherine Payne, then he too would have inherited Katherine Payne, her children, and all of their labor. And he maintained that Mary Maddox had done this deliberately, freed her to deny him a portion of his inheritance. But instead of going to the courts about it, he's going to take advantage of the ambiguity of freedom in this region. He and a slave catcher by the name of Thomas Finnegan, who is notorious in the Hagerstown, Maryland area, and a couple of others are going to cross the Mason-Dixon line, make their way up to northern Adams County, and in the middle of the night they are going to seize Katherine Payne, and they are going to seize her children, bind them, gag them, drag them back into slavery in Virginia. That could have been the end of Katherine Payne's story. But not only is she tenacious, she is going to file several complaints against Samuel Maddox, suffice to say. On top of that, she's going to sue him for $1,000. And even in addition to that, while she's lodged in jail in Virginia, there are people up here in South Central Pennsylvania, free black as well as white, who are going to go to the courts and they're going to argue for Katherine Payne's freedom. They're going to say, hey, this woman was legally, legitimately free, and her freedom has been stolen from her, and it needs to be returned to her right now. Now, the courts actually agree with the premise that she was free. The real debate here is not whether Katherine Payne was free, but whether or not Mary Maddox ever had a right to manumit her in the first place. And if the courts had said that actually Mary Maddox was not allowed to do that, then Thomas Finnegan, the kidnapper, would not be charged, Samuel Maddox would not be charged, and she would remain in slavery. Fortunately, after a year of being in jail, 1845 to 1846, the courts will ultimately rule that Mary Maddox had a life estate and that she was therefore entitled to free Katherine Payne, and therefore that those who tried to enslave Katherine Payne could be held accountable. Samuel Maddox, off the top of my head, I don't believe ever really is. Thomas Finnegan will ultimately be sentenced to 5 years in a penitentiary for carrying out the crimes that he did here in Adams County. And that's, again, late 1840s, not very long before the Civil War. African Americans in this community are on edge because of Katherine Payne's story. And just a few years before that, Pennsylvania's personal liberty laws, which allowed them to protect free people of color from kidnapping, had been challenged on a higher level. So in the 1840s, African Americans are witnessing kidnappings. They're witnessing laws meant to protect them in Pennsylvania being threatened. And because of that, Gettysburg's free black community is actually going to participate politically. Now, they're not legally allowed to vote, but they are going to make their voices heard. And they are actually going to write and petition to the Pennsylvania government. They will express their desire, quote, in this petition, to free this commonwealth from all connections with slavery. Then, to achieve their aims, they ask Pennsylvania's government to, quote, repeal all laws which permit the holding of slaves for any period of time, as well as those laws which direct or authorize our judges, magistrates, sheriffs, constables, jailers, or other officers to aid in the capture and removal from this state of persons claimed as fugitive slaves. This is one of those great sources where we're not hearing the African American story filtered through primary sources created by white individuals, which is where we get many of these sources, but this is one coming straight from the community saying, we want more legal protections because the proximity of slavery in Maryland and Virginia puts us in danger. They're using their voices to protest this, especially because kidnappings are going to continue. It does not end with Katherine Payne, who, after she is freed, will eventually marry Abraham Bryan, and will unfortunately only enjoy a few years of freedom before she passes away around 1850, 1851. But someone else connected to the Bryan family, in fact, is going to experience the tenuous nature of freedom in this borderland. A name I mentioned earlier that I imagine some of you are already familiar with. Mag Palm. She watched clothing in town. She made a living for herself. She had a man with whom she lived, Alfred Palm. She appears in the census records. And Mag Palm became something of a local character around town because in the early 20th century she will be written about as Maggie Bluecoats, a woman who participated on the Underground Railroad while wearing a coat from the War of 1812. Now that account is highly sentimental, and it does portray Mag Palm as being something of a quirky, eccentric. It's not necessarily a flattering portrayal of Mag Palm, even though it does acknowledge her role potentially on the Underground Railroad. To get a better sense of Mag Palm, what she's actually like, I go to this source, the picture you are looking at. We don't have a lot of physical materials connected to Mag Palm's life. For instance, I said she's connected to Abraham Bryan. She did live in a tenement house that was located just out in front along the Emmitsburg Road. She's going to be a renter there. But Mag Palm in 1858 is going to experience something very disheartening. She is going to be walking home from work in the evening when she is beset upon, attacked by people who had actually been put up to do it by her own employers. The goal is to seize Mag Palm, bind her, gag her, sell her into slavery, with the full knowledge that she is a legally free woman here in Pennsylvania. The kidnappers are taking advantage of the fact that she is black, and they know that no questions will really be asked once she's south of the Mason-Dixon line, and they can profit and sell her. Now, Mag Palm is someone who will be able to fight back. My favorite account about Mag Palm is that allegedly, according to one of the newspaper articles, that when she was attacked, she fought back against her assailant by biting off his thumb. That's right. Maybe don't try to take someone's freedom and then you can maintain all of your opposable digits. That's the lesson we learned here today. Magpalm ultimately will escape. She will not be taken into slavery, but she does want to tell her story. And it's not enough for later in the 20th century for her to be told as the quirky, eccentric old woman that everyone got a good laugh at. Magpalm tells her story through this photograph. She has her image taken, and you can see in it how she is posed. What's she doing, folks? Crisscrossing her hands, right? She wants to demonstrate what those kidnappers were trying to do to her. She is telling her story, showing how they attempted to bind her hands to drag her into slavery. And what you get from that is a more powerful testament about her experience living here in Gettysburg. Now, Magpalm, among others, are going to live in this community throughout the antebellum period, well aware that kidnappings will continue to happen, that they are a constant risk. And they are subsequently also going to inform their experiences during the Battle of Gettysburg. Because you bet, when women like Magpalm, when men like Abraham Bryan, who by this point is living here with his third wife Elizabeth and their children, you can bet that they don't trust Confederate soldiers crossing the Mason-Dixon line and then coming into Pennsylvania. They know that their freedom is at risk, and as a result, some of them are going to choose to flee, others to remain here and keep a low profile, and again, at least one example of someone physically fighting back. And that is a series of stories we will share at our next stop, not here at the Abraham Bryan farm, but a little bit closer to the farm of Basil Biggs. In the meantime, do we have any questions?
How many children at one time ever lived in this small house?
Quite a few. I know I can't remember off the top of my head how many it was in 1863, but when Abraham Bryan is living here with Elizabeth Bryan, he had several children living with him at that time. Notably, one of the children actually living with him is a child that he had with Katherine Payne. Their child, Frances Bryan, will be living in this house with him, and then she will have older siblings as well. I'd have to double check the 1860 census for the exact number, though.
I asked that for obvious reasons.
Yeah, because it's small. Yeah, you go in there, and I will open the door for us. Basically, on the right, you have the kitchen area. On the left, you have a bedroom, and then upstairs is the loft. That is where the children would have slept. And I'm glad you asked that, because it gives me a chance not only to mention Frances Bryan, who of course is born to Katherine Payne and Abraham Bryan. She lived here in this house. But I mentioned how Katherine Payne, when she'd been kidnapped in the 1840s, she was taken along with her children. We are actually fortunate enough to have two pictures of her children later on in life when they were grown. And that is Eliza Jane Payne at the top and Mary Payne at the bottom. So while we don't have Katherine Payne's image, unfortunately, we do have the image of two of her children who went through that trial with her. The images are courtesy of Deborah Sando McCausland, who is a local historian here in Gettysburg. She is very dedicated to the Katherine Payne freedom narrative. As much as I love telling it, she tells it even better. She's dedicated her life and research to it, and she's the one who was kind enough to allow me to use these photographs. Any other questions? Hi, Melody.
How old were the kids at the time they were taken, do you know?
Several of them are under the age of 10. They are young. Anything else? All right, then before we head to our next stop, let me pull out my keys and attempt to niggle with that lock so you can get a peek inside the Abraham Bryan house.
Ooh.
But the Fugitive Slave Act, I think, in some ways doesn't come as a surprise to locals who are strong abolitionists, because prior Pennsylvania laws, the one I introduced when speaking was Trigg versus Pennsylvania, that had related to personal liberty laws that were designed to protect the people of color, essentially by making it harder for slave catchers to come into the state, and that had been ultimately overturned as unconstitutional. So Pennsylvanians all throughout the 1840s are fighting back to maintain these personal liberty laws. And then in 1850 you get the mother of the worst of the pro-slavery act, of course, the Fugitive Slave Act. 1858. So 1858 is for the capital being there are stairs, but what I've exposed more actually to the left part, but tiny, tiny little stairs.
people? How many people hold the title of National Park Historian?
Overall, I don't know. Here at Gettysburg at different years, we've had like 2 or 3. Currently, I'm serving a term position for 4 years, so I'm the only one who actually has the title historian here. But obviously a bunch of historians work here. Chief of Interpretation, any of RCs, no rangers, anyone who's out there giving you a program, they're a historian. I just get to have the cool title. And yes, I covet it. Alright, we're all gathered around here. I initially was going to take us down a bit further, but to be honest, I wasn't expecting such a large group. But I'm very happy to have all of you here. So instead of walking down to it, I'll point out the site I was potentially considering going to if we had like a crowd of under 10. And that's directly behind us. You can see the red barn in the distance. If I'm not mistaken, that is a post-war structure, but it represents a barn that would have been there in 1863, and you can see the little house peeking out just over the way. For those of you who know my nephew slash uncle slash it's a long story, John Nicholas, that is the Nicholas farm. But it's also known as the Peter Fry farm, the man who owned it during the Battle of Gettysburg. And after the battle, after the war, it would be subsequently acquired by the man you see here, Basil Biggs, whom I previously mentioned at our first stop as being someone who worked on the Underground Railroad, which we know from his obituary. We are fortunate that we actually have a picture of him here, as well as his wife, Mary. They are buried over in the Sons of Goodwill Cemetery, also known as Lincoln Cemetery, which I will highlight briefly at the end of the tour. Basil Biggs is one of the 10% of African Americans in Gettysburg who owns property. You saw Abraham Bryan's house and farm. Well, Basil Biggs, after the battle, of course, is going to own his own farm and house and barn. And he's able to do that because he makes pretty good money and he has respectable standing in Gettysburg as a veterinarian, specifically of horses. Which you might imagine the 1860s was a little more critical than it is today, given how transportation worked in the 1860s for your common folk. So he is a veterinarian, and he's doing rather well here in Gettysburg. He had originally been born in Maryland. Like Abraham Bryan, it's not entirely clear if he was born into freedom or into slavery, and he very well could have been born a free man because there is a large population of free people of color living in Maryland shortly before the American Civil War. We know that he loses his mother at the age of 4 and will be bound out as a laborer until at least the age of 17. After which he marries, has children, he's going to live in Baltimore for a time, and then in the 1850s he will come up here to Gettysburg. Like Abraham Bryan, he's able to enjoy the benefits that come with living in Pennsylvania. Because although I've emphasized repeatedly that freedom is not altogether free here in Pennsylvania because of the proximity of slave states, there are still meaningful differences. Legally, of course, by 1863, slavery is not something as an institution that exists in Pennsylvania anymore, or at least it's not supposed to. And in addition to that, children, Bryan's children, Basil Biggs' children, they can take advantage of public schooling opportunities that are provided for black children in Pennsylvania. Those are not necessarily provided in states like Maryland. So for Basil Biggs and his family, just like Abraham Bryan and others, they are able to enjoy a relatively comfortable life in here in Gettysburg. Although they of course always have to be on the watch for potential slave hunters coming over from Maryland and Virginia. And keeping watch is something they most certainly do in 1863. In June of 1863, that is when Robert E. Lee's men are going to make their way into the state of Pennsylvania. Notably, there will already be a raid that is carried out in Gettysburg on June 26th, talked about on a campfire program earlier this week with the upcoming anniversary. Shout out. But with the realization that Confederate soldiers are coming into Pennsylvania, many African Americans don't want to take the risk of being kidnapped and enslaved. And that's something they very much believe will happen. So, Basil Biggs, for example, he is going to leave, go up to Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, while the battle is occurring. Abraham Bryan, we know, is going to leave. And we know this from the accounts that come out of civilians who stay behind in Gettysburg. It's something white civilians talk about frequently in their letters, diaries, and memoirs after the battle and after the war. Take, for example, Mary Elizabeth Montfort. She'll talk about a woman she knew only as Aunt Becky. Potentially, she could be a woman named Rebecca McClure, who says, while she's leaving town, that she's, quote, going up into the hills and that no rebel is going to catch me and carry me back to be a slave again. As I said, I don't know this woman's identity. I suspect it may be a Rebecca McClure, because that was the only woman who appeared in the 1860 census who was listed as being black, or mulatto as the term was at the time, and having been born in a state where slavery was legal. And she was roughly the right age. But that said, the woman described by Mary Elizabeth could have been a woman who arrived between 61, 62, even in 63. All we know about her is that she's living and working in Gettysburg, and apparently at some point she had been enslaved because she is now hightailing it out of Gettysburg. Tilly Pierce, a girl with which you may be familiar, the 15-year-old who shares her account of the Battle of Gettysburg. She writes about this exodus of free people of color and how they leave Gettysburg in fear in the days leading up to the battle. She writes, not so sympathetically in my opinion, quote, "It was amusing to behold the conduct of the black people of town. They regarded the rebels as having an especial hatred for them and believed if they fell into their hands, annihilation was sure. I can see them yet, mothers anxious for their offspring would stop for a moment to hurry them up, saying, 'For the Lord's sake, you children, come right along quick. If the rebels catch you, they will tear you all up.'" This is, again, an example because it's not coming from any African Americans in town themselves. It is filtered through bias. You're getting it through the perspective of a 15-year-old girl who stays here in Gettysburg. She, based on how she phrases her sentences, I would say she doesn't understand the extreme concern that people like potentially Rebecca McClure are experiencing at this moment. But they're still telling information you can get from accounts like this. Just because sources are biased, and all primary sources, like secondary sources, are going to have their share of bias, that doesn't mean you can't read between the lines and get useful information. For example, Tilly Pierce is talking about individuals leaving town, they're packed up, they're ready to go. What's that tell you? To me, it tells me that these are individuals who were prepared for something like this to happen, who knew it could theoretically happen, and so were ready, packed, and ready to go when the time came. These were people who are used to living, in other words, on the edge of freedom. They know what they're going to expect. Now, although they don't receive universal sympathy, of course, some individuals who stay in town will render assistance. An individual I like to talk about very much on these programs is a man by the name of Owen Robinson. You can see here, he's another black property owner in town. He is what you would call an entrepreneur. He owns a business where he sells oysters in the winter, and in the summer, he sells what Mr. G sells. He sells that sweet, sweet ice cream. And that makes him endearing to several of the children in town. One of these children, after the battle, is going to talk about his experiences and his knowledge of Owen Robinson. Because he says, his name is McCurdy is his last name, he talks about how his father is actually going to render assistance to Owen Robinson. Because Owen Robinson will approach his family and say, "Hey, I'm leaving town, I'm getting out of here, but can you watch some of my property for me to make sure the Confederates don't take it?" He's worried specifically about his pigs. Now, thankfully, the young boy's father is willing to watch the pigs so Owen Robinson can leave to ensure his safety, and he will come back after the battle very much in one piece. However, it's a different story for the pigs. According to the young boy, recounting his memories of Gettysburg, the pigs in the midst of the battle were upset that their regular feedings were interrupted by the audacity of these soldiers to go to war in their backyard. So the pigs made a lot of noise, indicating that they wanted to be fed. But who, I tell you, is attracted by the sounds of loud, hungry pigs?
Hungry soldiers.
Loud, hungry soldiers, exactly. And so the young boy after the war will say, when Owen Robinson came back, if he ate any pork that fall, it was not pork of his own raising. Because those pigs, too, became casualties of the Battle of Gettysburg. Rest in peace to our dear piggy friends. So that's a rather amusing anecdote to leave off on. It's one of the few that I would describe in this program as being amusing, because generally speaking, this story, I hope you've gathered, is not a particularly happy one. It's one filled with stress, fear, and anxiety, and that's true for the people who leave Gettysburg, but also for the free people of color who decide to stay behind. This is something of a misconception that everyone left Gettysburg, and I'll admit, first and foremost, kind of my fault there. I tend to emphasize the stories of escape because I want to stress how fearful people are and the realities of the situation they're facing. But the truth of the matter is not everyone is leaving. Plenty of people are going to stay behind. An example that we have comes from Jacob Tahenbach. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, so if you are local and know how that last name is pronounced, forgive me for I have sinned. I don't know how to pronounce it. But Jacob is a young boy, and he recalls his family and their experiences during the battle. He's a young white boy, of course, so he's staying in Gettysburg, and of course he's hiding himself. He doesn't want to get in trouble. He doesn't want to get caught in the crossfire. After all, while free people of color have the unique concern about being kidnapped and enslaved, the one thing every civilian in Gettysburg is fearful of is potential property loss and being killed because there's a massive battle being conducted in their backyard. Jake and Tahenbach's family is one of those families. And it's a family that also happens to employ several African-American women as household domestic laborers. According to Tahenbach, he and his family were, quote, sure if the Confederates found these African-American women that they would be taken away. So throughout the day, his mother ushers these women into and out of the cellar. She has them hide downstairs so they can't potentially be taken. But if the Confederates were not present, she brought them out of hiding to continue their chores. Because just because there's a battle going on, that doesn't mean you're allowed to stop working. As Tahenbach recalls, those people really had plenty to do when the Confederates were gone. And more than once, he says, quote, my mother fed as many 13 Confederate soldiers at one meal with food that those women had made. So they are fearful for their lives, their liberty, and they're hiding sometimes, but at other times they're being brought out, forced to continue their chores, to continue cooking, and much of that food is provided to the very people they are afraid of. We have a similar account, this time about one young woman. She's just referred to as the servant maid, so we don't know her name. But she is one of those rare examples where we have from a person who lived here in Gettysburg at the time telling us her story. She is interviewed after the war, and her interview is recorded in a series known as The Battlefield Adventures. This young woman worked for a widow by the name of Susan Hartzell, who lived about a mile northwest of Gettysburg along the Chambersburg Pike. During the battle, Mrs. Hartzell, who has at least 2 children living with her at the time, and the so-called young servant maid, they are ultimately forced to vacate in the middle of baking. They've got to keep themselves safe, move themselves away from the heat of battle. Because as you, of course, I imagine most of you know, where's the battle largely taking place on July 1st, 1863?
Gettysburg Road, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not exactly living in what you would call a safe spot. So they leave, go next door with another neighbor, stay with him for a bit before once again Mrs. Hartzell, the young woman, the 2 children, they're forced to leave again. And this time they're going to go to the farm of a man by the name of David Hankey. If you look at the 1858 Atlas of Adams County, you won't see David Hankey's name on there, but you will see his father's, who had passed away in 1860. So David Hankey presumably is in control of the house now. At least we get that impression from the young servant maid, because she says they go to David Hankey's farm. But as they approach Hankey's property, she recollects that a rebel soldier stopped the group, looked her directly in the eye, and then turned to her employer, Susan. And this soldier, according to the young servant maid, told Susan Hartzell, hey, what are you doing with her? She's got to go come along with us. So this is not just paranoia that people like Basil Biggs and Abraham Bryan are feeling. Confederate soldiers coming through Gettysburg, coming through Adams County, are very much concerned with rounding up African Americans that they can essentially take as, quote, fugitive slaves. And for a moment, it seems as if the young servant maid is going to be one of them. Fortunately for her, Susan Hartzell is not happy to be approached in such a manner, and the woman's ready to share her opinion. Even though the servant maid says she was so scared that she was clinging to Hartzell's skirts at that moment, Mrs. Hartzell comes to her defense, takes one look at that soldier and says, you don't know what you're talking about, and just keeps moving on. They eventually make it to David Hankey's property, where they will go back down in the cellar of his house. And the young servant maid is nervous there too. She's just had an experience where potentially she could have been taken into slavery. She's now in the cellar of a neighbor's house. There's a battle going on around her. And on top of that, she notices when she's in the cellar that she is the only African-American woman there. That kind of puts her in a tight position, in a spotlight, so to speak. And things get worse when a Confederate officer comes to the house and requests food and a place to rest. And David Hankey is not in a position to turn him down. David Hankey, however, takes into account that this young woman is in his cellar, that this young woman is fearful about being potentially captured. And so what he does is he turns to the officer and says, if I have this woman prepare food for you, take care of you, in other words, will you make sure that she is not taken? Will you promise her your protection? And that is ultimately granted. And the young servant maid, although she's called upon to brush the soldier's hair, to prepare food for him, to be put in what was surely an awkward position, she nonetheless does it, and she is able to preserve her freedom because of the agreement David Hankey has made with that officer. Yeah. This isn't the only story like that, where an employer and someone who works for them strike out an arrangement in order to provide some means of protection in the town of Gettysburg. The next individual I'm going to talk about, I wish I had a photo of him. I would kill to find one. If you ever find it, let me know. This man is named Isaac Carter. He's just referred to initially as being basically a farmhand. His interview is recorded in the same set of interviews as the young servant maids are. But we know a little more about Isaac Carter. We know he lived 4 miles south of Gettysburg, just off of the Emmitsburg Road. He lived on the Alexander Curran's farm, which notably will be one of those houses that is fired upon during the Battle of Gettysburg, for which Alexander Curran's will subsequently have to receive protection. Isaac Carter's story, for the sake of this program, is also notable because that quote I began the program with, that I titled it, "We were right there when the battle begun," that is from Isaac Carter's account. Because he says, in his words in this interview, he talks about how a lot of people at the time of the battle had already skedaddled. They had already left. Black, certainly, some white individuals as well, they've left town. But he says he and his employer, Alexander Curran's, have not left. Curran's, in fact, is sick of leaving, because in the weeks leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg, there have been a lot of red alerts and false alarms going out about the rebels are coming, the rebels are coming. And when the rebels ultimately, in quite a few cases, didn't come, although in some cases they did, this has caused enough stress for Alexander Curran's that he is sick of running, and he turns to Isaac Carter, and according to Carter, tells him directly, "Isaac, we're not going to run no more." Now, I often wonder if Isaac Carter would have preferred to have left Gettysburg, like many others did, to find safer pasture. But ultimately, he is going to stay with Alexander Curran's, and as a result, he says, "We were right there when the battle begun," referring to himself and Alexander Curran's, but it's also a quote that can be applied to other African Americans in Gettysburg, like Isaac Carter, who stay behind. And when Isaac Carter does stay behind, he now has to find a place to hide. Thankfully, Alexander Curran's has put some thought into this. Or at the very least, Alexander Curran's is concerned about his horses, because he wants someone to hide his horses from Confederate soldiers. And that's something quite a few people in Gettysburg and the surrounding area will do. You will read letters from Confederates coming to Gettysburg during the battle, and they'll talk about all the strange places they found people hiding their horses. One letter I came across in our park library was a horse that was hidden in someone's basement. Others just took them off into the mountains. In this case, that's what Alexander Curran's is going to do. He's going to have his horses taken outside of town, hidden in the woods. And who does he have go with the horses, to stay with the horses, to also conceal himself? He has Isaac Carter go. So Isaac Carter, think about this from his perspective. It's late, he's not in his house, he's in the woods in the surrounding countryside, he doesn't really specify where. He's there with the horses, and he's on his own because Alexander Curran's is not going to stay with him. So according to Isaac Carter, he says, that entire time, quote, "I stayed there a-fearing and trembling, and I looked after the horses. But if the rebels had happened to come through, they'd have looked at them, took them, and me too. But they didn't get there." So Isaac Carter makes it out of the battle. He is not taken. He is not found in the area where he and the horses are hidden. But again, I ask you, and there's no set answer to this, but I've always wondered if Isaac Carter felt maybe there wasn't pressure from his employer, Alexander Kearns, would he have potentially left Gettysburg instead of staying there where he very potentially could have been caught? I can't tell you the answer to that, but it's something to consider in this moment. The story of Isaac Carter is very much a disarming one, I would say, because you get the story of a young man who's hiding in the woods, left by himself, as he says, trembling. This is someone who's in a very fearful position. But I assure you, Isaac Carter, after the war, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, is one of those individuals who decides he doesn't want to be trembling anymore, and he will subsequently enlist with the United States colored troops and have his chance to fight back in a way he was not able to in 1863. That does, however, our last story for this stop, bring us to an account of a young man who does fight during the battle. We don't know a lot of information from him. It's a soldier that's actually positioned, not a soldier, I'm sorry, it's a man who's positioned over on Culp's Hill. A young black man who is described in at least 2 different accounts as fighting over at Culp's Hill, one by a soldier of the 5th Ohio, and the other, I believe, by a soldier of the 109th. I share with you today a quote from the soldier of the 5th Ohio who described this young man in a newspaper article after the war. Signed off only as Katherine of the 5th Ohio wrote, quote, "During the battle, on the left of our regiment, July 3rd, an American citizen of African descent had taken position, and with a gun and cartridge box, which he took from one of our dead men, was more than piling hot lead into the graybacks. His coolness and bravery was noticed and commented upon all by who saw him. If black regiments fight like he did, I don't wonder that the Rebs and Copperheads hate them so." This is a man who fights bravely. And of course people want to know, who is this man? We have a similar account of an individual by the name of John Burns, the elderly white man living here in Gettysburg, veteran of War of 1812, who says the equivalent of "get off my lawn" and jump straight into battle. That seems to be what this young man has done here. And some historians suspect that the individual's identity is a fellow by the name of Randolph Johnston. This was a man who was from Gettysburg originally, and he wanted to fight back during the Civil War. He wanted to participate in the fight for freedom for enslaved people and for himself. Because even as a free man, as I hope I've established on today's program so far, freedom's not secure here in Pennsylvania, so he would have an invested interest in slavery being destroyed permanently. As a result, Randolph Johnston is actually going to raise and drill his own company of soldiers, and he's going to offer that company up to Massachusetts when they're looking to recruit more soldiers. But ultimately, he is told he's not allowed to offer this company to the state of Massachusetts. He's going to have to wait until Pennsylvania formally starts recruiting African-American regiments. Therefore, some historians speculate, because Randolph Johnston was obviously someone with knowledge, education, he was someone with military training who had trained others, potentially this is Randolph Johnston finding his moment to jump into battle, to take part and fight back. And maybe it was Randolph Johnston. But I contend this could also be an enslaved person who had sought freedom and had come along with the Union Army. These were individuals, as we'll explore at our next stop, that were called Contraband of War, freedom seekers who sought refuge with the Union Army, provided labor and other services in exchange for protection. So maybe this young black man who grabbed a gun, maybe he was someone who had tagged along with the Union Army. Maybe also he was an enslaved camp servant who found the opportunity to leave Confederate forces to come over to the Union lines. We simply don't know. What we do know is that this young man who fought that, regardless of his legal status, whether he was free, enslaved, Pennsylvanian, Virginian, or Marylander, he was in danger. Because for those who had not already fled, or for those who had not already hidden themselves, they were very much at risk of being kidnapped and enslaved. This is a point I want to reiterate. Again, this is not the paranoia of people like Basil and Abraham Bryan, who are just fearful that maybe Confederates will kidnap them. Unfortunately, there are extensive documented accounts, particularly of cavalrymen going through Franklin and Adams County, rounding up people to send back behind Confederate lines that they suspected of being fugitive slaves, even though they were actually legally free people of color. And it's their stories we're going to talk about at our next stop. In the meantime, do we have any questions?
Yes.
Yes.
The book you cited.
Yes, On the Edge of Freedom? No, another one?
The Battlefield Adventures?
Oh, Battlefield Adventures, yes.
Is that online?
Yes, it is. It's available at Hathy Trust.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. HATHI Trust. If you're ever curious, a lot of these primary sources are thankfully more widely available than they used to be now, thanks to the power of digitization. So the story of the unnamed servant maid, the story of Isaac Carter as the farmhand, their interviews instead are recorded in a book that's published as Battlefield Adventures, and that's something you can type up online and you can read them yourselves. Because I read you snippets, but if you want to read the full portions, those are available to you at any point that you have an internet connection. Which means pretty much anytime you're not in the visitor center, because the internet there is terrible. All right. Yes.
So these Confederate abductions, were these were these orders coming down from the high command, or were these just soldiers acting on their own? Or
I will tell us that at the next stop.
okay.
Kind of a mix of both, yes. And yes.
Well, how early in the campaign, of course, this kicks off in June,
Yes.
are they starting to get worried in this community here?
Fairly early on, I can say at least when you have accounts of people leaving, showing their fear and concerns, and even some of the stories of the kidnappings we'll discuss, those are in mid-June. So before, certainly at least 2 weeks before the battle kicks off. And the amount of concern shown will, of course, vary from town to town because there had been false alarms in the past. But definitely by the time Lee's men have formally and fully crossed over into Pennsylvania, the towns in this community are aware of it and they're responding accordingly. All right, let's get moving. All right, gathered around. I know we haven't moved too far, but it's an area where we can appreciate the landscape. As I imagine most of you know, we're standing on Cemetery Ridge. Directly behind us, we have Seminary Ridge. And if you look further beyond the trees, beyond Seminary Ridge, off in the distance, you can see the Blue Ridge Mountains peeking out. The mountains through which cavalry soldiers were traveling. Roadways going through there that enslaved people in the past had used to seek freedom. This is a powerful, interconnected region. And in July of 1863, these roads are going to bring soldiers into Gettysburg, but also into other communities as well throughout south central Pennsylvania. Not just Adams County, but nearby Franklin County is where many documented cases of kidnappings will take place, particularly by Confederate cavalrymen. You may wonder, where do these sources come from? Is it hearsay, word of mouth? We have the accounts, of course, from people themselves who experience it, but we also have accounts from soldiers talking about it rather openly in their letters back home, in their diaries. One such soldier who writes about this is a man by the name of John T. Gay, serving with the 4th Georgia. He would write home, I believe it was to his mother. He writes, "We were, quote, on a regular raid, gathering up horses, cattle, and army stores. We already captured a great many of each, besides over 100 black men and women. All are sent back as soon as they are captured, except such articles as are necessary for the army." So he is regarding these individuals, again, many of whom, as we will see, are actually legally free. He is looking at them as potential fugitive slaves. He is viewing them, in other words, as runaway property. And he therefore expresses very little concern or conflict over the, quote, rounding up and gathering of a great many that he documents in his letter. Other accounts come from those who witnessed the kidnappings, and they express more outrage, certainly, than the soldier does in his letter. In nearby Mercersburg, to give you a sense of that, I have a map here, which I stole from my partner who used in his campfire a few days ago. We have Gettysburg right here. Some of the places I'll be talking about: Chambersburg up here, Greencastle, Pennsylvania, Mercersburg off over on the far left. So these are the cities and towns that surround the Gettysburg area. And in Mercersburg is where one of these, quote, great slave hunts take place. In the words of Reverend Dr. Philip Schaff, who works at the Theological Seminary in Mercersburg, he wrote, quote, "On June 26th, the same time, mind you, that Jubal Early's men are coming through Gettysburg." Dr. Schaff writes, "This guerrilla band came to town on a regular slave hunt, which presented the worst spectacle I ever saw in this war. They proclaimed first that they would burn down every house which harbored a fugitive slave and did not deliver him up within 20 minutes. And then they commenced the search upon all the houses on which suspicion rested, and they succeeded in capturing several contrabands, among them a woman and 2 little children. Contraband is a loaded word during the American Civil War, and it has slight variations in meaning depending on who asks it, or who uses it, and when they use it. The specific definition I mentioned a little bit earlier. Any freedom seekers who make their way within Union lines in exchange for protection and offer information on the Confederate Army, or who offer their labor to Union forces, these were referred to by Union General Butler as being, quote, contraband of war. The term is very deliberate. He emphasizes their status in the South as being property because he wants to make the argument that he and other Union soldiers are not obligated to return enslaved people to slavery because their labor is being used against the Union forces. So he says, all right, if you regard them as property, as a labor force to be used against the Union Army, that means we can take them in the same way that you would gather up ammunition, supply, and horses, etc. So this is the legal justification that will eventually kind of set the precedent for what will eventually culminate in the Emancipation Proclamation and the course of wartime emancipation. But given the word itself being used to emphasize property status, naturally it's not really a term that African Americans themselves use. And many people in South Central Pennsylvania, when describing the contrabands they see, oftentimes they just use the term to be synonymous with black or African American. So even though you'll see accounts of, quote, contrabands being kidnapped, that doesn't necessarily mean they're actually freedom seekers who have escaped slavery in the South. They very well may be free people of color. That is just how that term evolved in when it was used more liberally as the course of the war went on. But I explained that term contraband to you because it's very important also from a Confederate perspective. Confederate soldiers are able to make the case that they are allowed to kidnap people they find in South Central Pennsylvania because they say, we are taking our, quote, runaway property. These are fugitive slaves. They are contraband of war. They don't recognize their freedom claims, even though in some cases they are, in fact, legitimately free people of color. And they have official orders to do this, since someone asked about it earlier, like, was this something that went on haphazardly, or does it actually have a basis higher up in the chain of command? And there is actually an order that is issued in early 1863, General Orders 25, which provides the protocol for dealing with, quote, fugitive slaves. Commanding officers were instructed in the Confederate Army, per these orders, to, quote, send the slaves so reported to the nearest depot with a register of the place and the date of their arrest, provided, however, that the said slaves or any of them may at once be delivered to the respective owners if claim is made and established on satisfactory evidence. The evidence they were looking for was not usually altogether that thorough. As we know from recollections in Mercersburg, Greencastle, here even in Gettysburg, we know people are being seized or nearly being seized who are legitimately recognized as free people of the state of Pennsylvania, some even born in the state. So these orders are being used as the justification for essentially enslaving anyone who looks like they could potentially be a fugitive slave. And that comes across in another quote that Dr. Philip Schaff shares with us from Mercersburg. He wrote that a day later, on June 27th, the Confederate soldiers, the cavalrymen, returned to Mercersburg with 21 people that they had gathered from Hagerstown, Maryland is one place, but also Greencastle, Pennsylvania. And he wrote, they, quote, claimed all these individuals as Virginia slaves, but I was positively assured that 2 or 3 were born and raised in this neighborhood. One Sam Brooks split many a cord of wood for me. So right there, you have an individual saying, I know someone who is free, who is kidnapped in the midst of all of this. And we also know that free people are being taken because Confederate soldiers will later report on them being taken. In addition to, of course, the stories we have of white civilians talking about people who are kidnapped. So far, the stories I have shared with you, in many cases, are of people leaving, hiding. Now, like Dr. Schaff, we're going to transition into stories of people who are actually taken. What happens to them, or are nearly taken. One story comes out of nearby Greencastle, Pennsylvania. In the days leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederates will go through there under the command of Albert Jenkins. Albert Jenkins and his men are going to round up about 30 to 40 people, all women and children, black women and children. This act is witnessed by the townspeople of Greencastle, and they are none too pleased to see people they recognize as free civilians being trapped and locked in wagons, about 4 wagons full of people. And they do something about it. Instead of just watching sadly from the porches, which is what some people are going to do in places like Chambersburg, these civilians actually step up, they accost the guards, they throw them in jail, and they free the people who are in the wagons. You can imagine, however, that Albert Jenkins is none too pleased by this. He actually comes up to the civilians responsible and says to them, if you don't bring me back those people you freed, I'm going to burn this town down. And that is not an empty threat. Because 1 year later, 1864, that same brigade will come back, now under a different command, under the command of General McCausland, and they will actually torch Chambersburg. So this isn't an empty threat. It's actually a rather loaded one. And the women who had been kidnapped, who have now been freed, some of them are so desperate to save their town, and I would imagine also the children who are with them, that 14 of them supposedly come forward and actually offer themselves. They say, you can take us, you can enslave us, just don't burn the town to the ground. Jenkins, however, leaves empty-handed. Not because these women ultimately have to perform the sacrifice, thankfully they do not, but because the necessities of war will ultimately drag him away. Greencastle will be spared the torch, and these women and children will go free. But that was not true for every woman, or certainly every child. One of the most moving accounts we have of a documented kidnapping comes from a black mother living in Greencastle by the name of Priscilla Marshall. She had several children, one known as Jack, sometimes he appears in the records as Zach, Sally, as well as Rosa. And in 1863, while the Gettysburg campaign is moving forward, those 3 children are going to be taken from her. And she won't see 2 of them again until after the war. And again, we know this. It's not just hearsay. In this case, she is actually going to have civilians from Greencastle write depositions and petitions on her behalf saying that they recognized her children were taken. And you can access this letter online through a database known as Valley of the Shadow, which talks about 2 communities on the border during the Civil War, Augusta, Virginia, but also Franklin County, Pennsylvania. So any letters, diaries, experiences that affected civilians of those towns, you can access those online. And one of those letters you can find is the petition of Priscilla Marshall, which reads, we are, quote, the undersigned citizens of Antrim Township, Franklin County, Pennsylvania, do certify that we are personally acquainted with Priscilla Marshall, and that an armed rebel force claiming to be under the command of General Jenkins and the rebel army in the year 1863 did by force take 3 of said Marshall's children named respectively Rosa, Sally, and Jack. She is reunited eventually in the 1860s with 2 of her children through help she receives from the Freedmen's Bureau. That is an organization you typically associate with the Deep South, North Carolina, Georgia, these government entities that came in to help guard the rights of newly freed people living there. But the Freedmen's Bureau also played a massive role in reuniting people who had been separated in the antebellum period through slavery, through sale, but also in reuniting people like Priscilla Marshall, who had lost her children due to kidnapping during the war. And she will be reunited with Sally and Jack. Unfortunately, if you look at the 1870 census, there's no record of Rosa living with her. And at the time she's reunited with the 2 younger children, she mentions that she has not found Rosa either. Which means maybe they were reunited. Ideally, they were reunited, and maybe by 1870, Rosa would have been old enough, early 20s, she would have been to have potentially been married and out of the house, which makes her harder to track through census records. But it's also very possible that Priscilla Marshall and that eldest daughter were never reunited again. We don't know what happened to Rosa. We do know what happened to some of the other individuals who were taken. And I will complete this final story for this stop actually under the tree. I can feel the sun coming out. I imagine you all can. Would you like to duck under the tree briefly for this last bit? Let's do that. All right, picking up where we left off. We don't know how many people were actually kidnapped and where everyone is sent. We do have some accounts. For example, Confederate newspapers talk about free people being imprisoned in jails down in the South. And one of those prisons is in Richmond, the infamous Castle Thunder. Many Union soldiers will be imprisoned here, but free people of color taken during the Gettysburg campaign from Pennsylvania will be placed here too. We know one of them is a young boy by the name of Joe. We don't know his last name, his surname. We do know, however, he's from York County, Pennsylvania, just north of here. Young Joe is described to us by a man named D.M. Eicher, who is a Chambersburg resident who gets into a little bit of trouble and suddenly finds himself lodged in prison down in Richmond. And there he will describe some of the people he encountered, including young Joe. He writes that Joe was from York and that he had been, quote, captured during the invasion, but he was allowed to, quote, come and go at his pleasure. Joe in this particular case had been tasked with a job that other prisoners didn't have. His job was to bring all the new prisoners over into their comfortable accommodations in the prison, where they would subsequently be until they were released. This is described in a rather humorous manner by Eicher, who clearly did have a sense of humor. He wrote, "Whenever we heard Joe's cry of fresh fish, we knew that some other unfortunate ones were to be added to our number, because the fresh fish were fresh prisoners." Joe, he said, quote, usually before leaving his charge would caution them to look out whenever they got there, or them fellows will potentially mug you. That is, go through them and steal whatever they had that was worth stealing. In some parts of the building, this was generally the case with fresh arrivals. So Joe is not only leading people to their cells, he is at least dispensing with useful advice about how to not potentially get mugged. Joe, you can see in this situation, does have a degree of freedom of movement. It's something that we'll actually see that some enslaved camp servants on the battlefield themselves would have. And notably, on the battlefield, some Confederate soldiers would express ire that enslaved people with the army were actually moving about with so much freedom when they weren't in a position to do so themselves. So notably, Joe does have a little bit of control here. He does have freedom of movement. That's important to honor his humanity, to acknowledge that he's not just there trembling behind a cell. But that doesn't mean we can't also acknowledge the fact that the circumstances of his imprisonment, of the movement he does have, are shaped by oppression. Joe is essentially the equivalent of an enslaved man before the Civil War who was able to leave the plantation, but could only do so because he had a written pass. So Joe has some freedom of movement here, but at the end of the day, you cannot forget that that movement is granted to him by the people who imprison him, and that ultimately he's at least 200 miles away from family and friends up in York County, Pennsylvania. He is not in an ideal situation. And we don't know what happened to him if he got out of Castle Thunder. Presumably at the war he eventually did, but that assumes he survived the rest of the war. D.M. Eicher doesn't know. He doesn't give us a more general account. Joe is just a small anecdote within his larger story that we are fortunately able to glean. An individual that we know more about, who was kidnapped from South Central Pennsylvania, is a man by the name of Amos Barnes. Amos Barnes had actually participated in a rather nasty business. During the war, in order to preserve his own freedom as the campaign is taking place, naturally, Amos Barnes doesn't want to be captured or kidnapped himself. So what he does in order to bargain for his own freedom is he does help other Confederate soldiers locate people who are hiding, so they can be rounded up and taken away. He hopes that this will ultimately save him from kidnapping and capture. And he will actually return with the Confederate Army to Martinsburg, West Virginia. And as he's marching down there, he thinks, okay, once we get there, I will be able to go turn around because I've done my part, and they'll uphold their end of the promise. Hold up their end of the bargain, so to speak. But instead, he writes that in the confusion upon arriving at Martinsburg, West Virginia, that ultimately he too is sent southward to Richmond, Virginia with other African American captives, and he will end up lodged also in Castle Thunder. And when he's there, he says he's watched closely, he's kept under lock and key, but eventually he gets a little more freedom. He is able to go work at a nearby hospital. And then he gets permission to work on a boat, gathering and transporting wood down to Richmond, where he can sell the wood. And he's actually permitted to keep some of the money that he makes. This actually isn't so unusual in Virginia. We'll see that a lot of enslaved people who were trained with particular skill sets would sometimes be granted the means, after they had worked their portion of the day, to use any remaining labor and effort they had to make a little money. that was not unheard of in the state of Virginia. So the fact that he was allowed to sell whatever leftover wood he had and make a bit of cash and coin, that's not unprecedented for the time period. That's actually typical in a state like Virginia. What's notable about this particular account is that with his money, Amos Barnes decides he's going to try and break free. He's not going to do that by running. Of course, it's rather hard to bust out of a securely locked and tightly guarded prison in the capital of the Confederacy. So he actually uses the money to bribe a Confederate guard to send a letter for him back to Mercersburg. And when that letter is received, 2 graduates of Dickinson College are actually going to coordinate and help Amos Barnes secure his freedom in December of 1863. We actually have a notation written by a Confederate clerk indicating that he was to be exchanged under the flag of truce, which you can see right here. Just this little notation indicating that Amos Barnes was to go free. Just another source confirming that the story is not something made up. This is a real person with a real lived experience during the Battle of Gettysburg, during the campaign. Now we know Amos Barnes goes free. We don't necessarily know what happens to every individual. That's unfortunate. I wish we knew how many were taken, where they were all taken. Was it just Castle Thunder? Probably not. Were people actually ultimately enslaved as a result of this, or were they kept in prisons the whole time? That information is scarce. What I think we can speculate on is that people like young Joe, when he was taken, or Rosa, Sally, and Jack, when those children were transported to the back of Confederate lines, probably would have been awfully scared. They would have been filled with dread and uncertainty, perhaps trembling the way Isaac Carter described himself. And they may have caught a glimpse of their future because as they're transported back to Confederate lines and surrounding south central Pennsylvania, they're going to see other African Americans. Not just men and women who have been kidnapped, but they're going to see the enslaved people that are brought along with the Army of Northern Virginia to Pennsylvania. And it's their story we're going to talk about at our next to last stop, just over at the Angle. Do we have any questions in the meantime? I do love a riveted audience. Or maybe you're bored and you're just not telling me, but you know, you can keep lying, that's fine. All right.
Is there a range of people who are taken to captivity?
Huh?
Is there a range of a number of those who were taken in captivity?
Yeah, the estimate is maybe in a couple hundreds is the current number that exists. But again, it's hard to put an exact number on that because a lot of the information we have is not like from a register that says X, Y, and Z were taken. It's from civilians saying we saw people get kidnapped. It's from people after the war contacting the Freedmen's Bureau. It's from newspaper articles in the South saying a free person of color is lodged here in so-and-so place. So it's scattered evidence, which is what makes history so compelling and sometimes so frustrating. You want to tell a clear, easy narrative with a beginning and end, but sometimes we just can't do that. Yet at the same time, I think that's what makes history as a practice worthwhile. Even when the stories aren't forthcoming and they're harder to find, I think that makes those stories all that more important when we are able to piece those bits of evidence together to ultimately share them at places like Gettysburg, where you'll note we don't have a lot of evidence of the African American community commemorated, for example, on this battlefield. You've got the Abraham Bryan House, which is great. Worth noting, however, that the only reason it was seen as being preservation worthy in part was because initially when photographs were taken of it after the war, it was because it was mistaken for being Meade's headquarters. But because of that little happenstance mistake, we have excellent pictures of it from 1863, so it can be rehabilitated in a way that conveys its authentic mid-19th century character. But that was really an accident of fate. That's not because initially the Park Service set out to tell Abraham Bryan's story. We are lucky that we have that physical evidence, because in other cases, we don't have it. We have the documentary record. We have the oral record. Many of these stories are passed down from family members who have been told of the experience of ancestors. A book I would recommend any of you to read if you are interested in the story of free people of color in Gettysburg during the battle is Dr. Hillary Green's Unforgettable Sacrifice. She talks about how African Americans in this region in particular remembered the Civil War, how they remembered the battle, and she herself had a personal connection to family members in this region at the time of the battle. So she had been told those stories, she said, growing up on a porch. So if you want that more intimate connection, because I hope I can tell this story well, but you're going to read that and it's going to blow your mind. It's a totally different perspective. It's a book that I think, frankly, by reading it, made me a better historian. So I would encourage you, if you want to hear about the experiences of free people of color, the trauma they went through, and what they did with that after the war, that is a book to pick up and read. Just came out in February earlier this year.
Title again?
Unforgettable Sacrifice, Hillary Green. All right, and now that I've done my advertising for the day, up to the angle. I was initially going to put us over at the angle, but you know what? This works a little bit better because we can tie back to the copse of trees at the end of the spot. But for now, I'm actually going to point us across the way, across Cemetery Ridge towards Seminary Ridge. Seminary. I know the difference, but you say it too many times and it becomes bleh in your mouth. Seminary Ridge. And you might notice a nice little monument across the way. Rather large monument known as the Virginia State Monument that is officially dedicated in 1917. I mention it, one, because Robert E. Lee is on top of the statue and he's locked eyesight eternally with George Gordon Meade's equestrian statue we were standing by earlier today. But that location is roughly where Pickett's men are going to step off during Pickett's charge. And that's normally why we talk about the monuments, the story, Pickett's men. But you have to consider that there would have been a lot of African-American men in that area as well. That's not something that's communicated by the monument, for example. The monument, which is about 41 feet tall, I believe, at the time of its dedication, was a very controversial monument. I don't think I am going too out of a limb to say, yes, monuments we know today cause controversy, particularly here at a place like Gettysburg. Well, I won't comment too extensively on that. Not allowed to. Point out story. The simple fact is that monumentation, commemoration, how we remember history, that has always been controversial. That's not something that just popped up in the last 10 years. Gettysburg was initially preserved by the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, and that will then subsequently pass on to the War Department before it goes to the National Park Service. And at the time that it's established, it's regarded, especially by Union veterans, as being a Union memorial park. Many of them will express anger and outrage at the idea of marking Confederate battle lines with a monument dedicated to Robert E. Lee or other Confederate states. Some of them are okay with general plaques establishing where the Confederate line is so that part of the story can be told, but many of them are actually aggressively opposed to the placement of a monument of Robert E. Lee. So when discussion first arose about putting the Virginia State Monument where it is today, there was quite a bit of controversy. An example I give you here comes from Union General Louis Wagner. He would write after the war that, quote, if we were right, meaning if our cause in the war was right, there's no reason that they, Robert E. Lee and Confederates, should be glorified. He says, quote, I'm opposed to placing the statue of any rebel general on the battlefield of Gettysburg. Ooh, big words. The Public Ledger Philadelphia Times similarly writes that, quote, it would be an insult to the memory of our dead defenders, whether Pennsylvanian or not, and to those living who gave their energies and their best efforts of their youth to overthrow the man whose statue it is proposed to place in honor upon the soil he desecrated, and which the blood of our comrades made sacred. So if you think people get mad today on Facebook yelling at each other surrounding the Confederate monument debate, oh, leave it to Union veterans in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. They got pretty feisty about it too. Hence, it took a long time for that monument to eventually be placed there, and it was under tight regulations in terms of how it would be sculpted and what it would ultimately look like and what it would say. For example, the sculptor William Sievers is told that he is not allowed to put the traditional stars and bars on the monument. He is only allowed to do the Virginia state flag. So the Confederate, what we think of it today as the main Confederate flag, he was told he was not allowed to do that when he sculpted the monuments, even though it's the Virginia state monuments. On top of that, the words that are inscribed on the monument say currently today, Virginia to her sons who fought at Gettysburg. Very plain, straight to the point, very non-controversial. And that is deliberate, because the Gettysburg National Park Commission, who basically oversaw what inscriptions would be put on these monuments, they really helped design the commemorative landscape here at Gettysburg. They said that any monument, Union or Confederate, placed on the battlefield could neither show censure, praise, or blame. In other words, they kind of wanted to push that message of reconciliation. We don't want to pull open the wounds of war, so anything controversial, We don't want to talk about it. We want to make it as neutral as possible. Note that the original Virginia inscription that was proposed was Virginia to her soldiers at Gettysburg. They fought for the faith of their fathers. Yeah. Faith of their fathers. Well, as Nicholson said, Nicholson is the name of really kind of the historian of the battlefield park as it develops. He would say at the time that yes, they fought for the faith of their fathers may be a fact, but it certainly opens the inscription to not a little adverse criticism. In other words, people would have to discuss faith and causation. They would have to talk about the build-up to the Civil War and the tensions and stress over slavery if faith or cause of any shape or form were acknowledged. So as a result, the Virginia Monument gets a very, very neutral inscription. What is more adulatory, I would say, is the actual design of the monument. I imagine a lot of you have seen it, but in case you have not, and because we're at a rather large distance from it, show it to you here. You can see Robert E. Lee and Traveler perched atop the monument, and then at the base you can see these smaller figurines. They're meant to represent the various occupations of Confederate soldiers who served in the Army of Northern Virginia. So you see the farmer, the youth, the students, the mechanic. The idea is to convey that Confederates from all backgrounds are serving in Robert E. Lee's army. They come from all walks of life. I point that out because what you won't notice, of course, is an African-American figure. There are many African-American men in particular who come with Robert E. Lee's army to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863. These are the men that some will eventually remember as being black Confederates, but these are not men who are on the battlefield as soldiers. They are men who have been impressed into the army to provide work and labor. They're enslaved people widely. They're enslaved people, in some cases, who come with specific people. Their enslavers are going off to serve in the battle, going off to serve in the war, and so they are brought along. One of the more well-known images is of Andrew Chandler and his, quote, enslaved camp servant Silas Chandler with the 44th Mississippi. You can see why people would be inclined to say, is that a black Confederate, someone who fought for the Confederacy, because he's uniformed as such. But you have to keep in mind that what he is holding for these pictures were likely props, and by having him dress up in a way that was identical to Andrew Chandler, it was a way of saying that Silas Chandler is an extension of him. It was in many ways another way of describing and conferring ownership, not acknowledging individual black military service. Black men after the war in some cases would refer to themselves as black Confederates, and the question then is why, if they were never formally enlisted, and why would they want to serve in the first place? You have to keep in mind in the late 19th century, especially after the failure of, well, not the, but, after Reconstruction comes to an end, and you'll have the rise of the KKK, for example, suppression of black populations in the South. A good way to protect oneself was to say, hey, I served you faithfully in the 1860s, I did this, I was a soldier. That's a way to make a little bit of money to protect one's reputation, to perhaps secure themselves from the violence of the post-war period. So that's where some of these Confederate soldier accounts will come from. But although the men here at Gettysburg, Silas Chandler is not one of them, he's out west, even though these are not black Confederates in the sense that they're soldiers, they're absolutely a crucial part of the army here. They're performing the basic functions of camp life. They're cooking, they're cleaning, they are building entrenchments in some cases. They're taking care of soldiers. These are men who help make camp life possible. And in the midst of battle, sometimes they will find themselves in danger. Sometimes they'll have to find themselves running to the aid of the person who enslaves them. And that will help continue to generate the story of the black Confederate soldier, or the faithful slave narrative is the other term you'll hear a lot. A lot of Confederates after the war will talk about having faithful slaves. This is again an example of a biased source, but one that can be illuminating for us if we read between the lines. Because there are people, like Silas Chandler, for example, who didn't run away during the course of the war. They stayed with the person who enslaved them. So the question is, then why? What would motivate them to do that? And we have an example we can look at here at Gettysburg, actually, by a Georgian. His name is Clement Anselm Evans. My brain wanted to say Adams. I'm like, I know Adams is not right. Clement Evans, he's with the 31st Georgia. He'll eventually go on to become a brigadier general. He is here during the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863, and one of the men who has come with him onto the battlefield is an enslaved camp servant, a man he refers to as Moses. He tells us a little bit about Moses in his account of the battle. Now again, keep in mind, like any source I've read today, what you're getting is Evans' perspective, but there's useful information here. So let me read it to you first, and then I'll ask you some questions. Clement Evans will write, "Moses is utterly spoiled. He regards himself as my guardian, thinking doubtless that but for him I would have been lost long ago. I appreciate his fidelity and shall reward his services by affording him after the war a life of peace and serene old age. Black as the ace of spades in color and my bondsman and slave for life, yet he is happier than Greeley, Beecher, or Lincoln." Anti-slavery people. "It would be cruelty to give him his freedom, and in fighting to retain my right of property over him, his children, and fellow bondsmen. I contend but for their happiness. He went with me through the Pennsylvania campaign last year, being well appraised that he had but to remain in order to be free. In other words, to stay behind in Pennsylvania. I offered him there the choice of remaining or returning, and he scouted the idea of living among the Yankees, but ultimately chose to stay with me." Alright. So that's Evans' perspective. Let's ask some questions about this. For starters, although he portrays Moses as being faithful, loyal, subservient to him, how do you think Moses thinks of himself, based on what we've heard from Evans? How does Moses carry himself? Yeah.
He butters up his master for his own self-interest,
Yeah,
to protect himself.
Right, he's saying he presents himself as someone who is his guardian, and that if it weren't for him, he would have been long ago dead. So this is Moses being prideful. He's like, yeah, I'm the only reason you're still alive. I'm keeping you here. So Moses obviously thinks well of himself, that he is a guardian, a keeper. He's not thinking himself as someone who's subservient, at least that's not how he's portraying himself, or as how Evans expresses it. Moses is saying he's there, he's his guardian, and he keeps him alive. That's a very different take from Evans saying he is my subservient bondsman and slave for life. So they both say he sticks behind, he sticks around, but you get two different perspectives from that if you ask that question. How does Moses think of himself? Now think of another question. What might Moses potentially be leaving behind in Georgia if he decides to stay here in Pennsylvania in 1863 while the war is still raging with no sign of ending?
His family.
Yeah, he presumably has family back behind, loved ones. Not sure about his age, so I can't say about children, but undoubtedly there's people he loved back behind in Georgia, an enslaved community that he was a part of. If he stays in Pennsylvania with people he doesn't know, people he's never seen before, the war's still going on, he's losing a lot of security. He doesn't have the security of friends and family and familiarity. So him going back doesn't necessarily say, I love slavery and I'm happy to be here, which is how former Confederates would interpret it after the war. This isn't the faithful slave. This is a man, in many ways, as you said, thinking of his own self-interest. He has other reasons that might compel him to not want to give up, that would compel him to stay here, which is essentially, for him, Pennsylvania is the unknown. So he's leaving things behind. What, in other words, then, Evans, as the enslaver, what does he offer Moses? He offers him a degree of familiarity and security that he doesn't have in a land that is ultimately foreign to him while the war is still raging. I mean, after all, Moses doesn't know if he stays here if someone's going to take him in. He doesn't know if he's going to find gainful employment. He doesn't know if white Pennsylvanians are going to treat him well. He doesn't have any expectations to that extent. It's completely unknown to him. Going back to the South, well, that's something he at least knows. It's kind of like, what's the quote about, better the devil you know than better than the devil you don't? That's kind of the situation that Moses here has been put in. Hence why he might be inclined to help Evans, not just stay with him, but help him. As Evans would later write, once Moses came to me on the false rumor of my being wounded, and at Gettysburg he also came to the very line where I was. So Moses is going into the line of battle. He's putting himself in great danger. According to Evans, he manifests great apprehensions for my safety. Said he once, they've shot you twice, and shot all about you many times. Some of these times, if you don't take care, they will shoot you bad, and then what will become of me? That's the key phrase there. It's not, I love being enslaved, I'm faithful and loyal to you. It's, what happens to me if something happens to you? This is a prime example of self-interest. This doesn't mean that Moses might not have conflicted feelings, because he's known, obviously, his enslaver for some time. There's other dimensions to consider here, but at the end of the day, the idea of the black Confederate soldier, the loyal, faithful slave, which you will see in many primary sources as recounted by Confederate soldiers after the war, if you examine them a little more closely, you can see how they start to fall apart when you consider the motives of the people who are actually enslaved. That's the story you see here at Gettysburg. There's another story here to consider too. Even though Moses doesn't leave, there's a reason for Evans to be concerned. Because Moses, in showing bravery and going to the front lines of battle, he essentially undermines the basis on which white supremacy lies. An individual like Clement Anselm Evans has been told his whole life, he has been raised to believe, that an individual like Moses can't be independent, can't take care of himself because of his race. Yet here at Gettysburg, Moses demonstrates freedom. Or not freedom, demonstrates bravery. Freedom of choice, you might say, in that he comes up to Clement Evans on the battlefield. He puts himself at risk. So what Moses is doing, he's not showing that he's timid or cowardly or someone who can't take care of himself. He's presenting him as someone who actually takes care of the enslaver, because the enslaver is the one who's put himself in danger. So Moses, in other words, even though he stays behind, from the perspective of Evans, he stays loyal. In showing his bravery, he effectively undermines many of the ideologies on which slavery at that time in the Deep South is based. So that's something for Evans to be worried about. Hence why it's maybe easier for Evans to, after the war, to remember Moses as being a man who serves him, who's subservient, because it's harder to think about Moses as a complex human being who had bravery to go out into battle. And then, of course, there's other things that someone like Evans might worry about. Even though Moses doesn't leave Evans ultimately, there are other Confederate soldiers who come up here to Gettysburg, and the enslaved people that they said were so faithful to them do, in some cases, in fact, take this as their opportunity to run off and gain freedom. Howell Cobb, who's a Confederate politician, he would write, "If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." Hence why the indication of Moses' bravery is itself something very powerful. And then for those who decide to run away, Dr. Casper Henkel, 23rd VA Cavalry, would write, "We have a black man foraging for our mess who has kept us very well supplied. But he disappeared a few days ago, however, with Colonel Williams' horse. He took off with it." Another man by the name of Waddell, I'm sorry again if I'm pronouncing names incorrectly, he would say that the man that was with him, the enslaved black man who was with him, ran off and took his luggage with him as well. And a Chambersburg resident would write, or rather state rather sarcastically to one of the Confederate invaders he came across, he would write, "Your black men run to us a little more willingly than our horses run to you." His way of saying, it's like maybe they're not bound by loyalty. Maybe the decision to stay or run is informed by something more complex. I bring all this up so we can look at Gettysburg in a different light. This is typically a battlefield where you don't think of African American history. Someone even commented on the program, there weren't African Americans here because there's no USCT troops here. And, yeah, it's true, there's no black soldiers who fight in an organized capacity here at Gettysburg. But you have free people of color who stayed behind. You have the enslaved people who have come up with Robert E. Lee's army. You have those who have sought freedom and are currently attached to the Union lines. Everywhere you look here, in the words of Dr. Scott Hancock, who's a historian here at Gettysburg College, he'd point out, even though you might not see it commemorated on the battlefield, blackness is everywhere here. There are stories to be told. And even after these enslaved people, for those who stay with the Confederates, even after they leave, even after they exit Pennsylvania, the story is not over there. Because those who hid, or those who fled, are now going to re-emerge, and they're going to have to deal with the aftermath of this battle. And at our last stop, we are going to talk particularly about how Black Pennsylvanians respond to this battle and what they do in the aftermath. Do we have any questions as the alarms run by us? Glare behind us. Alright. We will then make our way to our last stop in the National Cemetery, though I'll point out one thing here and curse me for not mentioning it to you. I said I can tie the copse of trees back into our main narrative in a way that does not involve Pickett's charge. You might remember earlier I mentioned Basil Biggs, the veterinarian who leaves in order to avoid being kidnapped. Well, after the battle, as I said, he bought that farm that's behind us, just on Lower Cemetery Ridge along Tawny Town Road. These trees are actually his property. He owns it. And one of the more well-known historians of the Battle of Gettysburg at the time will actually come up to Basil Biggs as he's attempting to cut these trees down, and he'll say, "No, you can't do this. These are significant. This is the high water mark of the Confederacy. This is the turning point of the battle. This is what really symbolizes the Battle of Gettysburg." There are many ways I can take those claim apart. We can talk about that potentially a little bit later. But I think we can all agree that the copse of trees has certainly become a symbol of the battle and Pickett's charge. And they were nearly cut down until Basil Biggs is told, he's convinced rather, that if you let the trees continue to grow and you keep them here, there is more value to be had for you in the long run than just cutting them down now. So Basil Biggs will in that way be caught up in the post-war drama of the battle because he wants to carry on his life and farm his land, and now he's coming into conflict with those who are trying to establish this commemorative landscape. And ultimately, he agrees on leaving the copse of trees behind. These, of course, are not the OG trees, as you would say, not the original trees. I believe it's usually stated in the Cultural Landscape Report that they're potentially descendants of the original trees that were here in 1863. So, loose connection. A lot of the importance in these trees is not so much what they are, as much as what they represent and symbolize. Alright, on that note, last stop on our tour, the only part that really involves a significant walk. We are going to go into the National Cemetery for our concluding notes. It's hot out, guys. I know you're in for the long haul here. We'll finish up in 15 minutes and I'll get you out of here, alright? Our last spot, of course, is a familiar one, the Soldiers' National Cemetery. The men who were buried here from the battle, Union soldiers primarily. There's debates about whether or not some Confederates were interned here, because like the debates surrounding Confederate monuments in the 1880s and 1890s, at the time that the cemetery was dedicated, there was an intent by the people of Gettysburg and certainly Union soldiers to ensure that it would be the resting place for specifically Union soldiers, which meant someone had to go out on the battlefield, determine who was Union, who was Confederate, and then bring them from their temporary shallow grave and then move them over here where they would be placed in their final resting spot. That is taking place all throughout the latter half of 1863, and even by the time Lincoln gives his famous Gettysburg address, the cemetery is not actually fully completed. That work of transferring and burying people is still ongoing. And one of the people carrying out that work, especially on the battlefield, is our aforementioned Basil Biggs, the man who owned what is famously known as the Copse of Trees, who lived at the farm that we spotted along the Tawny Town Road after the battle, the man who was a veterinarian who had left during the battle and gone off to Wrightsville. When he comes back, not only does he find that his property has experienced much destruction, he's going to be one of the main people who takes charge at disinterring the Union dead on the battlefield and moving them over here to the Soldiers' National Cemetery. But it is, in fact, even in Gettysburg, very segregated work. James Sheeds, a civilian, would write, quote, "The work of collecting the dead and placing them at a single point was directed by a cemetery association that was organized and headed by David Mills. Basil Biggs of Gettysburg was given the contract for disinterring the bodies on the field. He had a crew of 8 to 10 men in his employ. Samuel Weaver, who actually did the identifying of the dead, he directed Biggs' men, and as each body was removed, Weaver went through the uniform pocket with an iron hook and sought for any means of identifying the body, seeing if they had a letter on them, a photograph." Yes, that did disrupt the solemnity of the moment, did it not? But he would go through and try to identify the dead, but the dead themselves were disinterred and moved to that common point by Basil Biggs and other local African Americans. Although we don't have Biggs' image during the disinterment process, or we don't think we do have an image of these men at work digging up the dead so they can be moved here to the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Let's see Basil Biggs here. Men like Biggs are responsible for helping create the cemetery we have today, where you can come and honor some of the fallen from the Battle of Gettysburg. And notably, this work he did, again, it is segregated. As Sheeds would write, the reburial at the National Plot was in the charge of the white men, while uncovering the dead on the field was done by those who were black. So the hardest work, arguably, certainly the dirtiest, the grossest, what for me would be mentally, in my opinion, the most straining, that is being done by Biggs and his men. And mind you, these are individuals, especially Biggs as a property owner, who are also dealing with destruction on other parts of the battlefield related to them. But they're also taking up the work of making sure the Union dead are properly laid to rest here. That is the task they will take on for themselves, despite the fact that, at least not initially, black troops are not going to be buried in the Soldiers' National Cemetery. They were segregated in death according to local historian Betty Myers. To me, at least, it's not clear if there was a rule that said no intermixing at the time, or if it was basically social practice and it just worked out that way. But suffice to say, in 1867, because black soldiers are not being buried in the Soldiers' National Cemetery, they will instead be buried in a local cemetery that is dedicated as the Sons of Goodwill, or the Lincoln Cemetery, and seen image of it here. Men responsible for that cemetery are men like Basil Biggs, Owen Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, Randolph Johnston. They are all associated with this cemetery. That is where Abraham Bryan and his wife Katherine Payne, the woman who was kidnapped in the 1840s, they are all buried in that cemetery. And Bryan, of course, like Biggs, is going to come back to an utterly destroyed landscape. His house, because it's right there, basically in the middle of Pickett's charge, withstands significant damage. And when he famously petitions to get some money and compensation from the government, he is awarded a whopping $15. That's not going to help terribly much. He, however, will remain in Gettysburg, as does Basil Biggs and others. Some will leave after the battle, but that doesn't mean the black community here disappears. It doesn't at all. It reconfigures as new people move and settle here in Gettysburg. And many of those people will be veterans of the American Civil War, black Civil War veterans. Others will be those who did not move here, but who stayed and were themselves black Civil War veterans. And that's an important point I want to make. The story shared thus far is of people leaving, of people hiding. And very understandably, there's no shame in that, I would argue. They were protecting their lives and freedom. But many come back from that experience, having seen people kidnapped or being afraid that they would be kidnapped, and understandably, they're dealing with this sort of mental trauma. They want to find a way to fight back, find their way to reconcile how they feel about this Gettysburg campaign and what uniquely happened to them here. So what many people do is they subsequently enlist from Adams County and in the Gettysburg area to serve with the United States colored troops. As Dr. Hillary Green would say, I mentioned the book earlier, Unforgettable Sacrifice. She wrote, quote, "The raw memories of seizure, helplessness, and the reality of Confederate occupation had made black men impatient enlistees who wanted to be, quote, more active participants in their fight for freedom." There's two individuals in particular I'll highlight here. One, I previously mentioned. Remember the soldier who fought, not the soldier, but he basically served in the capacity as a soldier, the young black man on Culp's Hill who fought back, who fired over into the, quote, graybacks? Mm-hmm. The suspicion was that that man might be a fellow by the name of Randolph Johnston, the man who had trained and raised, basically drilled his own company. Well, while Randolph Johnston ultimately does not get to provide service during the Battle of Gettysburg, or at least not that we know of, if that wasn't him at Culp's Hill, he may have possibly gone up and offered his services up in Harrisburg. That is a possibility. Or he may have gone and hid, left, avoided conflict. We don't know for sure. But we do know that after the battle, Randolph Johnston is going to enlist with the United States colored troops, and he is going to serve honorably as he does so. And he's not the only one. The first black USCT, United States colored troop veteran buried here in this national cemetery, is a soldier by the name of Henry Gooden. Let's see. Do I have the picture right here? It's hiding from me. I do not, forgive me. But Henry Gooden is buried here in the cemetery. In fact, let me point you out this sign over here. This is the Gettysburg Gettysburg National Cemetery Wayside. Basically, your instructions for how do you get around the cemetery, how do you identify where people are buried. Henry Gooden, we know, was in his early 40s. He's a laborer. He's from north of here. We don't know a lot about Henry Gooden, but ultimately he will serve during the war and afterwards come back, and he will pass away in 1876. He's buried in the Almshouse Cemetery. He doesn't receive a soldier's burial here over in Gettysburg. He is not moved here until the early 1880s, and we don't know under what circumstances. But Henry Gooden, from Adams County, the surrounding region, who had experienced the realities of occupation of Pennsylvania, he will subsequently serve at the USCT, and later, after he passes away, will eventually be transferred here to the Gettysburg National Cemetery. And he is buried in the U.S. Regulars plot, which is number 13, you see here. So if you continue to make your way around the cemetery towards the Soldiers' National Monument, that row that you see that's closest to the monument, closest to the road, he is buried there. Position 30, I believe, row D, which would be the front row. So if you'd like, after the program's over, I'll walk over there. You can come with me if you'd like to see it. But Henry Gooden is buried here. He, like Randolph Johnston and many others, will respond to the experience of the Gettysburg campaign, not just by participating in the burial of the Union dead, but finding their own opportunity to fight back. They never again wanted to be in a position where they're there where a battle is starting and yet not able to participate. They will play their role. And that cemetery that they established for themselves before black USCTs are allowed to be buried here, or start to be buried here, at least. They established, like I said, it's called Lincoln Cemetery. Now, it's initially the Sons of Goodwill. It acquires the name Lincoln later because the land itself had been sold to a group known as the Lincoln Lodge. But undoubtedly, African Americans in Gettysburg thought of Abraham Lincoln as well, who came here November 19th, 1863, gave a rather famous speech called the Gettysburg Address. You may have heard of it. African Americans from South Central Pennsylvania, Maryland, they will be present. They will come and listen to him when he talks about a new birth of freedom. And while Lincoln never explicitly mentions anything like slavery or emancipation, for example, he's trying to keep the Union unified, and he wants to keep Northern Democrats on his side, so he doesn't talk about the Emancipation Proclamation directly. But in talking about a new birth of freedom, he is alluding to how the course of the war is changing, how it's taking a path where it will result in the destruction of slavery. And certainly any African American members who were in his audience would have been aware of that when he talked about a new birth of freedom, because they understood how their freedom was threatened in 1863, because many of them had been right here when the battle began. And that, folks, is where I will conclude for today. Thank you for sticking with me. I realize, that was about a 2.5-hour battle walk on a very warm day. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, please have a wonderful time here at Gettysburg. Enjoy the upcoming anniversary. And again, just enjoy yourselves. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
You were wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you. Yep, South Central Pennsylvania, early 40s, survives the war. Forgot to mention he was with a regiment that would have been a part of the Appomattox campaign at the very end of the war. So he would have been in the vicinity during the surrender. And then ultimately comes back, lives through the 1870s, and then after he passes will be reinterred here in the early 80s when the cemetery in a sense becomes officially integrated.
Yeah,
Colored troops
that's
that
my
were
question.
moved here at that time? Or
Yeah,
was
we
it
have
just him?
There's another as well by the name of Charles Parker with the United States Colored Troops, who had actually been buried up, you were asking about Yellow Hill earlier, he had actually been buried up in a cemetery in that area. And in the early 20th century, there's work being undertaken in order to ensure, all United States soldiers of the Civil War have had a proper burial. And his grave is discovered up there, having fallen into immense disrepair. And so he is subsequently transferred from his burial place up there to a grave here in the Soldiers' National Cemetery. So Charles Parker and Henry Gooden are your two United States Colored Troop representatives from the Civil War buried here. And then you have other African American soldiers buried here from the Spanish-American War as well. And I believe we actually, in our records, I don't have it with me, but we have an image of that burial ceremony of those men who were interred here as casualties from that conflict.